Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring spiritual awakening. With me is Professor Marjorie Woollacott, who is an emeritus professor of neuroscience and human physiology at the University of Oregon. She is the author of the textbook Motor Control, Translating Research into Clinical Practice, and is also author of a recently published book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. That book recently won the Book Award from the Parapsychological Association. Welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You have now been practicing meditation for many decades, and are, I guess it's fair to say, a deep student of meditative traditions, and particularly the tradition that you got started in with your meditation, Kashmir Shaivism.
Yes.
How did it start for you?
Well, first of all, I should say that I was a materialist scientist really all of my youth and into college and graduate school. And by that I meant that I really didn't have any experiences that were what I would call spiritual, and I often thought that anybody that did was weak-minded. So that's the starting point of all of this. And then at one point I was teaching in Virginia, and my sister, who did meditate, invited me to go back to a workshop by an Indian meditation master in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And I went, but I was skeptical. I was nevertheless just a little bit curious. And I thought, well, it was my birthday. She invited me for my birthday. Why not go and see her? So I go to the meditation retreat. And I arrive that first day. And in the beginning of the very first session, they tell us that the Swami is actually going to be walking around the room and initiating every individual there. And they say that the initiation is going to be a spiritual awakening, and it's going to happen through the Swami's touch. Now, clearly, the scientist in me was incredibly skeptical. It's like, really? But I thought, look, I'm here for the weekend. Why not just put my skepticism aside and see what happens? And besides, I really was curious to see what would happen. So when the Swami began walking around the room and reached me, my eyes were closed, but my senses were otherwise fully engaged, so that when I felt the touch of his fingers between my eyes on the bridge of my nose, I had an absolute certainty about the event. And what I felt was literally a current of electricity go from that point between my eyes down into my body, and I could feel the exact point where it stopped. It felt a little bit like a mini lightning bolt going down inside of me. And I had the sense that this was like almost this electricity actually awakening some new energy inside of me. And I began to feel my heart begin to expand outward. And as it expanded, energy that felt like pure nectar, like love, began to like flow through my whole being and beyond. What was interesting to me is that the words that went through my mind had nothing to do with scientific analysis. The words were, I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. And I think what was more interesting for me was that when I went back home to my university teaching in Virginia, there was a 180-degree shift in my habits starting the morning after I returned.
So this was like instant transformation.
It was. And for a scientist, that was mind-boggling, I might say. So it was. And that instant transformation actually changed these habits, for example, by having me wake up in the morning at 5 a.m. spontaneously and get up to meditate and to do this day after day after day. And in fact, it's never ceased. And I realized that one of the reasons I was doing that is because I now knew that just below the surface of my awareness, there simmered this quiet ecstasy. And I knew that I tapped it once, and I felt like it was there waiting for me.
I almost have the sense when you had the words pass through your mind, I'm home, it suggested to me that maybe something from a past lifetime was awakened.
Interesting question, and I often wondered about that. You're reminding me that when I was an undergraduate, I was actually a music major before I went into neuroscience, and I would talk with my fellow music majors about the fact that they were having these wonderful, ecstatic, sometimes spiritual experiences, and I said to them once, it felt almost like if I had a soul inside of myself, that soul had no windows on it, and I had no way of experiencing this higher level of reality. And it was almost as if for me, there was this like cracking open of something inside of me that finally let me experience what other people around me had experienced perhaps all their lives. So.
Well, I can say this. I have received the same transmission from the same Swami myself, and while it was very nice, it was nothing like your experience. So obviously, it's different for each person.
It is.
I mean, according to the Hindu traditions, I suppose they would say, depending on your karma.
Yeah. And you also raise an interesting point. I have another friend who is a neuroscientist as well, and was an absolute materialist before he took his first meditation workshop as well. And he had an experience that was actually even more dramatic as my own. And maybe I'll just quickly share that one with you too. So he was at this point a trainee in neurobiology, developmental neurobiology, as a postdoctoral fellow. And his wife had wanted him to come to this meditation workshop. And he said that during the day of the workshop, he said he didn't notice anything specifically happening in that moment, but when that first day ended, he began to notice some sort of energy beginning to build inside of him, and it began to get stronger and stronger in the evening. And he said he didn't know what it was or what its source was, but he had the sense something important was about to happen. He went to bed at night, and in the middle of the night, he is awakened by this jolt of electricity going up his spinal cord, and with a loud bang, like an explosion, exploding out the top of his head with this incredible light that he said was the most beautiful light he had ever experienced in his life. And he said his eyes were closed at that moment because he was again, in his bed. He had been asleep. And he said when he opened his eyes, he realized he had actually left his body, and his awareness was now hovering at the top of the room, looking down on everything around him. And he said that started for him, like me, this transformation where he meditated every day from then on. And he said that at one point he began to feel this light he had experienced in that first meditation fill his body more and more and more, until at one point he said he felt like waves of ecstasy and light were just traveling through his whole being. And he said he felt like he had entered the heart of God. And he said what was interesting is that he felt at the same time more like himself than he had ever felt before. And that reminds me again of that I'm home feeling. Something happens where this is my real home inside of me.
Now, as a neuroscientist, I imagine that you were curious about this feeling of an electric current running right through, basically right through your brain, where there are no sensory receptors.
Right. Well, yes, and you bring that interesting point up that my neuroscience mind could not actually understand how this could relate to my materialist worldview. And I think that was the starting point of a feeling of a little bit of a schizophrenic existence inside of me, that I had my neuroscience view, and I was still, of course, a university professor in neuroscience. I continued to do that, interacting with my materialist colleagues, and yet at the same time I was having experiences that could not be explained by that view. For example, as you said, there are no receptors in the middle of my brain, and I was experiencing tingling sensations, for example, right in the center of my being. Also tingling sensations all around my heart. And it was like, how can this be? Is there some other subtle energy that we don't really talk about in neuroscience that I'm experiencing in these moments of meditation?
So that began both an intellectual quest and an ongoing spiritual practice for you.
Absolutely. And so, in fact, what would happen is that during the mornings, I would always get up at 5 a.m. to meditate. I would be exploring in what I would call my own internal laboratory what meditation was really doing and what it was about. And because I had this scientific basis for my whole career and my whole training, I really tried to treat my meditation a little bit like an experiment. So I would watch my mind. And I found that fascinating. I mean, just finally, for the first time in my life, watching my mind. And I should mention that what you typically hear in meditation, and what this meditation master had told me, was we should try to quiet the thoughts of our mind, because then we're in touch with our highest self. Now, right there, that was against my own scientific upbringing, which is thoughts are good. The more thoughts, the better. You want to have these brilliant thoughts so that you can actually be more creative. And I was hearing now, no, try quieting your mind, because creativity comes from this place of stillness inside of you. But so I was watching my mind and realizing, first of all, it's very hard to quiet the thoughts of your mind. And I think that's one thing I would actually share with anybody watching this particular interview, is that some people think, oh, meditation, that sounds easy. And they start to do it and they realize how hard it is for them in those first weeks and months and years. And I say, it is hard, but it has lots of benefits. And finally, you find that place where you can actually see it, just a little bit of a space between thoughts, and you can begin to widen that space, bit by bit over the years.
Well, I assume, since from what I gather from that day forward, from the day of your initiation, you've been meditating daily.
Yeah.
And we're talking now, I'm thinking around 40 years or more.
That's right, exactly, yeah.
Every day, you haven't missed.
Well, I should say that, for example, I may get up in the morning at 4 a.m. to go on an airplane flight to a foreign country, and then I might meditate like on the plane or something like that. But yes, I also realize that, first of all, to have a real meditation practice that's sustainable, you have to be flexible. And so sometimes you move the meditation to later in the day, but I have this thirst for meditation. It's literally a thirst for that experience of stillness and quietness. So it's not hard for me to make time one time or another in the day.
Well, that's what also kind of suggests to me that there's a past life. You were a monk or something in a past life, and it activated right away, because it doesn't sound like you were struggling to meditate.
Yeah, well, and you do raise an interesting point, and I know that I've been occasionally to friends that talk about past lives, and they said, I think perhaps you were a monk in a past life, or in some sort of a monastery somewhere, and who knows if that's the case. It would be fascinating to actually
I presume you don't have any memories like that.
No memories myself, no.
Yeah. Okay, well, I know in another interview we're going to talk about reincarnation research, but for now, you began trying to apply the intelligence of a neuroscientist to your meditative experiences.
Yes. Right. And I found that it was very helpful for me to actually see what was going on in my brain at these times. And I realized that one of the things that we often do in meditation is we use a mantra. We take the aid of a mantra. Yeah. And there are different mantras in different traditions, but I realized one of the points of using a mantra is that it's replacing all of those distracted thoughts going in 1,000 different directions with one thought that brings your mind into a still point inside. It concentrates it into one particular place, and I think that's the start of meditation. They also say that mantras are charged with the power of the tradition, and they have an ability, just in terms of the energy of those syllables themselves, to bring you inside. So I was watching that to see if that was the case, and I realized that that's literally what happened to my own mind. It went from like one thought after another, talking about my own internal dialogue of what happened yesterday, what I would be doing today, into this quieter place of one thought. And then I realized at that point I could begin to let that one thought go and finally go into this place of what I would call pure awareness, pure clarity, where no real thoughts, perception, I'm still here in the room and I can perceive what's happening, but it is so peaceful because my own thoughts aren't interfering. All those judgments and evaluations that go on in our mind constantly.
That would be like consciousness without an object.
Yeah, exactly. Consciousness without an object, which sounds perhaps a little bit boring to some people, but in fact, when you're there, you find the peace that passes all understanding, as some people say. It's amazing, the sense of stillness, and the fact that when you're in that place, you don't want to be anywhere else. There's a joy that bubbles up from inside of you that is ecstatic.
And did you find that this practice affected your life in other ways?
Absolutely. I think that was an interesting thing too. So get up in the morning at 5 a.m., meditate, and then I would go into the university to start my day with my graduate students. And I found that I was much better at keeping my equanimity when things would go wrong in one way or another. I mean, I was in an academic department, the Department of Human Physiology. We have lots of powerful, egotistical personalities, and we're all like working, trying to get our own vision accomplished. And we would have lots of arguments, and I would watch in a department meeting and see that if I could begin to focus on my breath, repeat that mantra silently to myself, I could settle down and I could hear other people's opinions a little bit better and not get so drawn into into the drama and see the real intention underneath of our group in terms of what we were trying to do. Very helpful.
But it didn't, I gather, other than the dramatic change in your personal discipline, it's not as if you changed your life. You continued working as a university professor.
I did, exactly. And so, and I should mention here that created some very interesting internal conflicts in my life. So here I am by day going to my university and talking to people from a materialist perspective. It's like I had my materialist hat on. And so I would talk to them as if I knew nothing about meditation. And then I would go to my meditation classes. I would teach meditation or yoga. I would be talking to my friends in meditation, and I would talk to them from a whole different point of view, talking about energy centers in the body, chakras and things like that. And it created an incredible schizophrenia. And it affected, in fact, I think my husband, Paul, even more than it did me. And I'll give you an example. So here we are at a department dinner. We're all sitting around together, neuroscientists, and Paul would begin to bring up one of his favorite subjects, which might be energy medicine or healing or acupuncture, something like that, only to get a kick under the table from me as I would politely help him change the subject. And it was because I was so afraid of losing my credibility with my colleagues that were neuroscientists. And so finally, after about 25 years of leading the schizophrenic existence, I decided I had to do something about it. I had to try to find a way of integrating those two halves of my life. And in fact, what I ended up doing then is during one of my sabbaticals, I was able to actually go back to the University of Rochester in New York and take courses during my sabbatical in Sanskrit philosophy, in Kashmir Shaivism, in India philosophy, things of that sort, and begin to put together an understanding of consciousness from the scientific perspective and consciousness from these Indian traditions and see how they might actually meld together.
Now, my studies of Hindu philosophy and Vedanta have suggested to me this is an extremely rigorous philosophical tradition. They are just as logical and the word I'm thinking, consistent and deep as Western philosophies.
Absolutely. I think that we sometimes forget that when we hear that these texts were written, in this case with Kashmir Shaivism around the 10th century, the 11th century, etc., we think, oh, well, that was so far in the past. What did they know? And yet you realize they knew an incredible amount about these sorts of things because they were scientists of their own minds. They were watching their minds. They were watching their attention and their observation.
These are people who would spend their lives as monks and meditators, and they believed that looking inward, I guess a much more sophisticated version of what the 19th century psychologists would call introspection. That was their methodology, and they developed very rigorous philosophies based on it.
Exactly. So you can imagine somebody sitting there in a meditative practice doing that for many hours of their day and going into these deep states of what I might call unity consciousness, where they literally feel like they are one with everything in the universe. And then when they come out, they really contemplate about this and they observe what was happening and they say, perhaps what I'm really observing in my own awareness is what happens with all of the universe, which is there is this pure awareness that is perhaps the start of any particular thought or action. And that then begins from this place of expanded consciousness to contract down into a particular thought or intention or goal. And that becomes a particular thought in your mind, which then may move into action and then manifest itself in the world. And so they literally have something called Tattvas, which really means thatness. It means like the essence of creation. And they start out with the very top tattva as pure awareness, what they might call Shiva, which just means pure consciousness. And then that contracts bit by bit down into the mind and its own smaller thoughts and its intentions, and then down into the aspects of the senses and the physical world, etc. So they really imagine consciousness contracting down into the universe. And they say that we, because we are consciousness too, do that same thing in every single action of our day.
So whereas Western science would say that we evolved, maybe if you go back far enough, from microbes, Over billions of years, we evolved from microbes. In the Vedantic philosophies of India, it's more like we have descended from a state of God consciousness.
Right. And in fact, some people call that idealism, meaning that mind is fundamental or consciousness is fundamental and it contracts into matter, versus materialism, which says the material world is fundamental, and little by little we might have our mental awareness coming out of that. But of course, many of the materialists say that's just an illusion, that we actually have a mind. It's not real. We're just these little robots with a mind. Yeah.
Well, I would presume in your studies, and you went and actually got a master's degree eventually in
Asian studies.
In Asian studies. So you studied the Sanskrit language, and you studied Kashmir Shaivism, and I presume you probably studied Vedanta.
Yes.
So I gather that when you really get into it at that level, you discover there are competing schools of philosophy going back to the 10th century and earlier.
That's very true. And I think that when you look through India, you see exactly what you're talking about. And in fact, the Kashmir Shaivite view is one that I really resonated with, because it was saying that consciousness is not only what I would call transcendent, but when the world actually is created and consciousness contracts down, it enters into every material object of the universe. And so you have consciousness within all beings and all things. So it means that even a little tiny electron has an aspect of consciousness. It may be a crude aspect, but there it is. A grain of sand, that has a crude aspect of consciousness, but it is in everything. Now, there are a few other forms of Indian philosophy that say, no, consciousness is transcendent, and then the material reality is separate from that. So I resonate much more with the Kashmir Shaivite point of view, that really all this is consciousness. This would be one of the phrases that you would hear all the time. All this is Shiva, but all this is Shiva means all this is conscious awareness.
Well, my small understanding of this tradition is that Shiva, or sometimes equivalent to Brahman, the absolute consciousness of the universe, is somehow very passive, that it takes Shakti, the female energy, to express the power of Shiva in the material world.
Exactly. And you're right. In India, you often hear about those dual aspects, the Shiva and the Shakti aspect. And as you said, that's what it is. Shiva tends to be more the passive, totally still aspect. And when Shiva decides, in a certain sense, to manifest, then Shakti is the manifestation. It's the energy of the world that contracts down and creates all of this. And you often see this as sort of like this dancing aspect of the world, too, the beautiful dance that's put into play.
Yeah, there's a lovely sculpture of the dance of Shiva.
Yes, exactly. In fact, and he's always dancing on what they call the demon of forgetfulness, because that's when we think we're just this material reality and that's all there is. And his dance is on that, helping you to awaken to this whole understanding of something much, much broader and bigger and beautiful.
How about the concept of illusion, or Maya? When we talk about forgetfulness, we sometimes, I guess, forget that there is divine energy in everything around us. Is that part of your study as well?
Absolutely. I think when you look at those tattvas that I was talking about, you get down to a particular tattva, which is the tattva of Maya, which is finally, it's when Shiva, when consciousness forgets that it is absolute awareness, absolute knowledge, and eternal. And that's when Maya, illusion of separateness, comes in. And from that point onward, we all think we're these individual souls, and we don't understand that we have this interconnection with everything in the universe. And I think what I really like about that is that when you receive a spiritual awakening, what Indian traditions say happens is that these malas, which we might call these areas of these knots that actually keep us in ignorance, begin to be broken open. And one of them is Anava Mala. And Anava Mala is the feeling of separation from non-local consciousness. And at that moment of awakening, you suddenly know that you are part of this infinite, beautiful world. And I think that's why we have that feeling, I'm home. In that moment of awakening, that Anava Mala is gone. It's cut.
Did it ever return from time to time for you after that?
It's a very good question. So what I should say is that at some deep, subtle level, you know, and you can always get back to that place. And constantly throughout the day, we're thrown back into our feeling of separateness. And I think that what meditation is really about as a journey is little by little getting more moments of our day where we're back in our heart, that feeling of being at home, and not in this feeling of separateness from other people.
Well, it sounds like quite a journey that you were on. One of the understandings that I have of these traditions is that they have a very detailed description of human anatomy, but it's not the material anatomy that one finds through dissection. And I know you described as a child dissecting a gopher, and that started your scientific journey. But this is like an invisible anatomy.
It's true. And so that you make an interesting point that when I was a young child, all I knew was material reality, and I was a very curious little child, and I could see why that sort of propelled me into science. And so here my mother is trying to get a gopher out of our front lawn who is making burrows everywhere, and she ends up killing him and leaves him on the front lawn. And I go into the kitchen and get a little kitchen paring knife, and my sister reminds me she was there too. And we open the gopher up, and I see all of these little organs inside it. I'm fascinated by the inside of the gopher. And what I realize is that that's the materialist perspective of what we are inside. But as you're saying, the Indian perspective, and in fact, it's not just the Indian tradition. If you look at almost every mystical tradition of the world, they talk about subtle energy centers inside of our body. And for example, in the Indian tradition, there are typically 7 chakras. And again, chakra means wheel. And these are these energy centers that they feel are literally turning inside of us. And the lowest one is at the base of the spine. They move all the way up toward the top of the head. The top of the head is the crown chakra, sometimes called the Sahasrara. 1,000 petals of like light beaming out from the top of our head. And I experienced those from that very first moment of meditation. I basically experienced my heart center and the energy expanding from that, the energy between my eyes and at the crown of my head. And what's interesting to me is that I had never even heard of these things before. I was a materialist neuroscientist, and suddenly I was experiencing them, and then I read about them later on. Now, most neuroscientists say, well, clearly, those can't be real because we know what the body looks like. And when you read the Indian text, often if you translate the Indian text, literally it sounds like these energy centers are inside the spinal cord or along the parasympathetic or the sympathetic nervous systems. I don't think they are in the physical body because I believe they are subtle energy centers that we feel in those particular places, like perhaps interpenetrating the physical body, but a totally different system of energy than the physical body.
Now, back in 1973, I actually, when I was a student at Berkeley, sponsored a symposium on the Berkeley campus on frontiers of consciousness, and I invited a Swami to speak. You may know Dr. Ramurti Mishra, who had translated the Yoga Sutras. And he gave a lecture on the chakras, and he claimed that the chakras were each correlated with the endocrine glands. How does that strike you? You
know, I think when we say correlated, that might be a key word, because what correlation can mean is the chakra can literally affect the glands. And I believe that very well is possible, because literally our energetic levels definitely affect our physical body. And we know that if, for example, we are experiencing an incredible amount of depression, it can affect our immune system, etc. And different chakras, according to these various Indian systems, do seem to be correlated with different aspects of our body. And in fact, if energy healers supposedly can work on a particular chakra, they can increase the function of the portions of your body that that chakra governs, you might say. So I could understand that that would be the case, but I would imagine that he also wouldn't think that that chakra was literally like in a particular gland itself, that probably it is more an energy center governing it rather than being...
Well, you talked about these different levels of the tattvas.
Yes, right.
Or thatness, or suchness.
Yes, right.
That philosophy suggests that there's sort of a spectrum from the physical reality that we understand to all the way up to the highest, most refined levels of divinity.
Right, yeah.
And that we're part of that continuum.
Definitely. And I think that we're part of it and we are all of it. I think that's the beautiful thing about it, that literally what meditation is about is getting back to that pure, expanded state. And some people say, well, I meditate an hour a day. I will often tell people I meditate about an hour a day. And what the real sages of meditation say is they meditate 24/7 because they have gotten to that place where they're always in that expanded state. So they've moved their way back up the Tattvas, so to speak, to literally be in that place. And I think that William James uses a word about like a co-consciousness that he believes people have, and I'm beginning to believe that what he means is that these people and ourselves can be in two places at once, so to speak. I can be here talking with you, and at the same time, I can also have this awareness of the non-dual nature of everything we're doing, and they can coexist one on top of the other in any moment.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, Marjorie. I know we could probably talk forever, and I'm delighted to say we will have several other video conversations. So I encourage our viewers to check the listings for additional ones. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.